gets complicated when you talk about being infected with the coronavirus and actually having COVID-19. So that's how we have to parse all this stuff. But if you have an antibody that's directed at the spike protein, either the antibodies are killing the virus or at least preventing replication, which would mean the viral load that you have in your bloodstream is probably much lower than it would have been if you didn't have the vaccine. Makes it much less likely that you're going to shed any virus. So it's just common sense that most likely, if you're preventing infections of people, it's going to be much harder for that individual to be the link in the chain to another spreading event, right? I mean, we should be optimistic.
Yeah, and I think
I know we need to keep, with the qualifiers, but the vaccine is not a vaccine against COVID, against immune cells that overreact. It's not that. It's a vaccine against the spike protein of the virus. So either it's killing the virus or preventing it from replicating, which makes it much less likely that you're going to be in a position to transmit it, right?
Yeah, Joe, and I think that's why most people are optimistic, including myself. We're hopeful that the data is going to demonstrate that. You don't want to get too far in front, because this is really a critical question. This is going to get to the issue that Andrew raised about how important of a public health tool this is, how good of a public health tool this is in terms of reducing transmission, reducing infectivity. Because if you get vaccinated, do you need to wear masks? How careful do you need to continue to be? That's a critical public health question. Ultimately, we're not going to really fully answer this just with experimental evidence. We're going to have to rely on real-world evidence. There was data out of Israel, actually, in the last 48 hours that suggested that patients who were vaccinated were less likely to become infected with the virus. They were actually doing PCR testing on them and testing them for asymptomatic infection. So that's the first bit of real-world evidence looking at a population that's been vaccinated to see how they performed relative to people who are unvaccinated. So that's the kind of evidence ultimately we're going to have to rely on.
Scott, just to emphasize that point, I think these are all valid questions right now, because there are people who are starting to get vaccinated. You start to wonder, can my parents come over and see the grandkids, or do I have to worry about them exposing them to that? Is it safe to not wear a mask at work? Is it safe to give hugs and be close to these people? And I think another question, and again, this is all for public information at this point as people are doing this. I was reading through some of the information about the J&J vaccine, and it seemed like it was effective. I think they said 57 days after you'd received the shot, it looked like there was an effective level of the antibodies that were there. I guess that raises the question, again, for people who are starting to get these shots. You're not safe the minute you get the shot. It takes time for any of these vaccines to build up in the bloodstream. When can you go back to your life if you've gotten one of the Moderna or Pfizer shots? And can we expect that same sort of expectation for the J&J shot?
Yeah, look, I think for an older individual who's vulnerable to this virus, certainly wait for the second shot. Wait for a period of time after the second shot until you're likely to have full protective immunity. I don't think people should feel completely secure after the first shot. I also think part of this, it's not a binary answer to the question about, can you relax some of the precautions? It's going to depend on what the prevalence is, what the overall environment is. And I think in an environment like the one we're in right now, where infection is everywhere, if you're a vulnerable individual, even if you've had the second shot and you think you have full protective immunity from the vaccine, it's still very prudent to continue to wear a mask and take precautions. And that doesn't mean you have to hibernate and have to avoid seeing family. Maybe you can lean forward in that regard, but wear a mask. Be more careful in those interactions. Because in a high prevalent environment, you're still at risk. I think when we get into a lower prevalent environment, these questions are going to be more operative. If you have a population that's more heavily vaccinated in a low prevalent environment, that's the kind of setting where I think we can relax. That's hopefully going to be the summer, the spring, if these new variants don't get a foothold here in the United States and change our trajectory. And, in terms of the immunity that the vaccines provided, looking out 20 days, 50 days, 70 days, those were just the intervals that were measured. I think what the data showed is that the full antibody response that you would expect from this vaccine or hope for didn't fully kick in until around after 2 months. And those levels were still continuing to build. But we don't know what it looks like 90 days, 120 days, 6 months. That's the data that we're ultimately going to generate in the post-market. How durable is the immunity? Moderna now has data going out a year, suggesting that it's a durable immunity out a year. Pfizer is going to have data that looks out a longer time frame. So, we're going to have better information around what the durability of these vaccines is as well.
Shepard Smith here. Thanks for watching CNBC on YouTube.